I'm Rebecca Ritters. Welcome to the program. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a, quote, military operation in eastern Ukraine, just as the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was speaking at the emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, urging him to give peace a chance. The late-night televised address from Putin came shortly after self-proclaimed separatist leaders in eastern Ukraine asked him for military support. It's the latest culmination in a series of escalations that began on Monday when Putin recognised the independence of two regions in eastern Ukraine, including territory controlled by Kyiv.
I'm addressing the Ukrainian army. Please lay down your arms. Your granddads and your great-grandfathers did not fight the Nazis and defend our common fatherland so that neo-Nazis would seize power in Ukraine. You made an oath to serve the Ukrainian people. They are a fascist junta who have seized power. They're plundering Ukraine and exploiting its people. Don't fulfill their criminal orders. Lay down your weapons and go home.
And to help us walk through this developing breaking news story, DW's Charles McFedrin joins me in the studio. Charles, bring us up to speed. This is obviously developing and fast-moving. Tell us what we know so far.
Rebecca, firstly, I need to go through what President Putin said in his speech, which was delivered at around 5 a.m. Moscow time, just as the UN Secretary-General was speaking, as you mentioned. As he did in his speech on Monday, he tried to delegitimise the Ukrainian government, which was democratically elected in 2019. I was there. I reported on that election. It was regarded as free and fair by the OSCE. I went to polling stations. I saw people voting. That indeed is a falsehood. Vladimir Zelenskyy, Ukraine's president, is Jewish. He's Russian-speaking. He's from the south of the country, from an industrial town.
You're referring to the comments that Vladimir Putin made, accusing him of being a Nazi, is that correct?
Of being a Nazi, indeed. And President Putin gave a speech which was similar to the one he did on Monday. It was aimed at delegitimising Ukraine and delegitimising the government. It now appears that the aim of this operation is perhaps to remove that government from power and replace it with one to Moscow's liking.
Now, we're hearing reports, President Putin did say that this was a special operation in the Donbass region, but we're hearing reports of this being a much wider invasion. We're hearing reports of stuff obviously happening in Donbass, bombing in Kramatorsk and even explosions in Kyiv. Are we witnessing what everyone was fearing, the worst-case scenario?
We're witnessing the worst-case scenario. It does appear like that. I've been talking to sources, contacts, friends for the past 2.5 hours. There are explosions in not just Kyiv, the city, or also outside the city in suburban areas, particularly reports coming in from the airport, Borispol, where it appears that anti-aircraft guns are working. Perhaps it seems like strategic targets around the city are being targeted for now. But many of my contacts were woken up by sharp explosions about 2 hours ago. Kyiv is a city of 2 million people. There are also indications that the fighting is ongoing in Kyiv, the second largest city, nearly 2 million people. In Odessa, the port city near the Romanian border, 1.5 million people. In Mykolaiv, in most of Ukraine's large cities, at least in the south, the centre and the east of the country. This is not just limited, it appears, to Donbass, that is the Lugansk and the Donetsk regions. This is an attack on, or this is an operation against many Ukrainian cities.
Just terrifying for Ukrainians on the ground. You mentioned some of your contacts, friends. You've reported in the region widely. You've been speaking to some of them this morning. What are the reactions so far?
I understand that there's absolute terror and panic in Kramatorsk, which is only about 80 kilometres from the front line in Donbass. It was expected that any major operation would begin in the Donbass and there may be a forward movement of troops troops. That is yet to be determined at this hour, but one would expect it. Throughout the country, that there are reports coming in of the scale of this. The Ukrainian Interior Ministry says there are already hundreds of casualties. We'll have to see how those figures firm up because it's only been a matter of hours since this began. So Rebecca, this is a fluid and a developing situation, but it does appear that the worst case scenarios, which Western security services and Western governments indeed had been warning of for months, are now coming true, and we're seeing a major escalation, perhaps a war between some of Europe's largest countries, or some of Eastern Europe's largest countries.
Just, yeah, shocking news for people just tuning in for this. Despite the fact that we've been reporting on this for months now, it still has come as quite a shock. Now, stay with us, Charles, but I would also like to bring in DW's correspondent, Nick Connolly. He's on the phone. He's just got off a train near Ukraine's second biggest city. Nick, can you hear me? We've lost him, unfortunately. So, Charles, I'm going to come back to you in the studio. We'll try and get him back on the line and speak to him there. He's near Kyiv, and we'd love to get his insight to what he's seeing. But we will bring in DW correspondent Fanny Fasher, who's in the capital, Kyiv. Fanny, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Rebecca.
What a night, Fanny. What a morning to be waking up there in Kyiv. What's the situation like where you are?
People have been waking up to explosions. I have heard several of them myself shortly actually after this televised address by President Putin. Then he's going to attack, first of all, eastern Ukraine. But as we are hearing the sirens here in Kyiv, there's right now a really complete bracing for a huge escalation of full-scale war here on Ukrainian soil, as we have just heard from President Zelenskyy and also his foreign minister. Now, the sirens mean also that people, of course, are urged to stay at home. Just yesterday, the a state of emergency law was approved, which is going to affect today, but that actually is being changed into a martial law, which basically means you need to have papers when you go to the street. You need to identify yourself. Also, curfews will likely be imposed. The airspace has been already closed today. It started actually this morning with a restriction, but now there's a complete ban on civilian flights. So, Rebecca, the situation is really tense here in Kyiv early this morning, and it's really unclear what else is to come. Russia claims they are not going to attack cities or civilian infrastructure, but only, as they say, military infrastructure. But this is definitely not what the perspective here is from the Ukrainian state government, urging everyone as possible to stay at home and not go to the street. Definitely a very critical moment for Ukraine and for the people here in this country.
Fanny, I know it's very early, and of course this is just developing, and you may not have had a chance to speak to that many people yet, but how are people reacting there? Because I know that in the lead up to this, people, by all accounts, were very calm in the capital and saying that they weren't convinced that this was going to actually happen, that they were used to this kind of military bluster. I mean, that's obviously changed, but how are the people reacting there?
People are not really surprised, unfortunately. Some that I've been speaking to were almost sort of waiting that it starts, in the sense that this uncertainty is finally over. People here in Ukraine, people in Kyiv, I've been staying, were under emotional stress, under emotional, psychological strain, because this is going on for weeks now. There have been several dates floating around in the international community that an attack is imminent any day. It is imminent in today. There were so many different dates. But now that it is unfortunately here and the invasion has started, and it's unclear yet just how far that invasion is going to go, as I just said earlier, President Putin said that it's an attack on eastern Ukraine, citing a genocide by Ukrainian forces, citing that Russia's security is being here at risk because of NATO's expansion. Having said all of that, people here in Ukraine are not really surprised, but of course very much scared, and they hope that there's not going to be bloodshed, that in fact the international community steps up and the allies that have been vowing to support Ukraine both in a military way, in an economic way, actually will step up and make those promises, put those promises into action.
Now, Fanny, I just wanted to remind viewers, I mean, this story is moving so fast, but for those just waking up to this news, a few hours ago, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy made an emotional plea to Russians in Russian not to support, quote, a major war in Europe. He said that the Russian people are being lied to and that Ukrainians didn't want war. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
I'm addressing you, the Russian people, as a Ukrainian citizen. We are separated by a border stretching more than 2,000 kilometers, and right now there are 200,000 of your soldiers there. Your leadership has authorized them to move into the territory of another country. And this could mark the start of a major war on the European continent.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy speaking obviously before Putin announced his so-called military operation. It fell on deaf ears. What was Volodymyr Zelenskyy hoping to achieve with that speech, do you think?
That the West steps up, that there's a clear signal also towards Russia that Ukraine doesn't have to go through this by itself on its own. Now, that frustration that we have heard or being expressed by President Zelenskyy, we have heard also last week at the Munich Security Conference, where he was basically saying, what is the West actually waiting for? Why is it that there are only mild sanctions that may be coming? But at that time, no sanctions were still in place, no preemptive sanctions that President Zelenskyy wanted at that time to actually avoid, in his view, that a further escalation takes place. Now, a few days have passed, of course, since then, and the EU and the US are coordinating with other allies, NATO allies, to have a coordinated response when it comes to punishing Russia for this aggression. The question here is if it's too late or not. The explosions have started, and in contrast to what Vladimir Putin said, that he wants to defend eastern Ukraine, it's far beyond that border already, far beyond that Donbas border, and military from the north, from Belarus, just 200 kilometers from here, is being reported to have been mobilized as well. So really, the entire country of Ukraine, to the north, to the south, to the east, is encircled by Russian troops. At this point, it's really, really just unclear how this is going to further escalate here in Ukraine and here in Kyiv, where I am now.
Fanny, what response are we likely to see from the Ukrainian government this morning?
As it was announced shortly after the first explosions took place, that the airspace is going to be closed for civilian aircraft. So we are also expecting that actually curfews are going to be announced. At this point, it's still just a call on people to stay at home, basically decide for themselves what's right and wrong, but making clear that it's not really a good idea at this point when everything is still uncertain where these explosions may take, what shellings may take place also in Kyiv, if it's really a good idea to leave. Now, at the same time, also the martial law was announced, which clearly means that this is not just a state of emergency that's been already approved yesterday for the coming 30 days, which could be extended by another 30 days. But martial law is a really strong statement. It really tells you it is no longer about some little shelling in parts of the east, but this is really going into a bigger invasion, a bigger escalation. And as Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and his foreign minister also made clear, this is an aggressive war. But at the same time, they also sounded, or want to sound, in fact, very self-confident not to cause panic here on the ground, saying Ukraine is going to defend itself, Ukraine is staying strong, Ukraine is staying united. Something that I've been hearing from people here in Ukraine, here in Kyiv, from various generations who say, we are not going to flee if there is a strike on Kyiv. We are going to stand together and help our military, be it by donations, be it by any way of showing Russia that this war is not going to be won by Russia. Unfortunately, what people were speaking about just yesterday seems to become the realpolitik right now. They actually will have to defend themselves. Also, in addition to what the Ukrainian government is saying, I want to just point out one more thing. There's also permission for civilians now to carry firearms, basically telling people you could defend yourself, obviously, if there is not enough protection that can be provided by the Ukrainian government.
Right, Fanny, thank you. Dealing with Fanny Fasha in Kyiv. Now I'd like to bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who just got off a train near Ukraine's second biggest city, Kyiv. Nick, what's happening where you are?
Well, I'm in a small town that's just waking up and trying to make sense of all these reports coming in. People here have told me they heard explosions coming from the direction of Kharkiv while it was still dark. They assume that was from a Ukrainian military airfield being attacked by Russia. While I've been here, we've heard planes in the air, and it sounded like jets, not like normal civilian aviation. I've seen people in uniforms, people from various kinds of emergency services, told me that they've been called up. They don't quite know where they're going to be heading, but presumably heading towards the Donbass. We're about 150 kilometers away from Kramatorsk, which is the administrative capital of the Ukrainian-controlled Donbass. Police armed with machine guns, obviously very nervy, but generally just confusion and disorientation that this is actually now happening. I think after so many months of these warnings, I think people kind of had convinced themselves that this was just bluff, that this was posturing, brinkmanship by Vladimir Putin, but the realization that this is probably now actually happening, not just in Donbass, but also there's reports coming from Odessa that Russian troops have come from the sea. So far we don't have full confirmation of that, but reports from Odessa, from Mariupol, another city on the sea further east in Ukraine, that really is a very worrying picture, and one that has people here asking themselves if they should leave, if they should try and get further away from Donbass, or if the best thing is to stay put at home.
Well, I mean, people must be extremely worried. What are they doing there where you are? I mean, you mentioned that people had been up until this point, and it's something that's been widely reported, quite calm, quite not expecting this to happen. Are you seeing a lot of shock on people's faces?
I think it's kind of nervous confusion is the first reaction. Right. People just, some of them seem a bit kind of paralysed. I saw people in uniform stocking up at a supermarket on sugar, water, cigarettes, coffee, presumably expecting that they're going to be sent to the front lines and not close to kind of any kind of civilization for a while. Just a very kind of nervous laughs and just, confusion. I think the important thing to remember here is that Ukraine has been at war since 2014, since Russia annexed Crimea and stoked those separatist conflicts in Donbass. Soldiers have been killed basically every week since then. So that explains why people kind of thought this was just more of the same, escalation on the same kind of scale, maybe a bit more than they'd seen before, but it wasn't a total shock. But the idea now that targets in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in cities far away from the front lines have been hit by Russian missiles, that really is a whole new dimension and something that really has people here very, very worried.
So people more ready now? Are people you're speaking to making plans? Are they making plans? Are they able to get to safety if there is, presumably wider escalation of this as the morning unfolds?
I mean, here in this, I'm in a very, very small town. I think most people, I've been speaking to, said they really don't have anywhere to go. And for most, they think for now the best thing is probably to stay put. But certainly we're getting reports out of Kyiv that some of the big highways leading Kyiv towards the southwest and western directions away from Russia, already they're seeing traffic jams. And certainly can't confirm that, but those are the reports doing rounds on social media. And certainly lots of institutions, lots of businesses seem to be evacuating their people from Kyiv now. So definitely, an attack on a totally different scale than was expected, and something that, is causing a lot of worry here on the streets in Kharkiv region, about 150 kilometres from Donbass.
All right, Nick, thank you very much for that. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon. Now, I'm back in the studio with Charles McFedrin. Charles, is Ukraine prepared for this? This has been, obviously, there have been warnings of this for months, but Zelenskyy has been calling for calm this whole time. Are Ukrainians prepared?
We're about to find out in the coming hours, I think, Rebecca, the degree to which people have been prepared. Vladimir Zelenskyy, throughout this crisis, which has been building for months, indeed, since the autumn, the late autumn, has been somewhat of a consoler-in-chief for the Ukrainian people. He often stressed the economic impact of this crisis on the Ukrainian economy, and he faced the task of keeping essentially the show on the road. We saw overnight, just hours before this all began, Zelenskyy appealed to the Russian people, not directly to the Ukrainian people, but to the Russian people to back down and to take to the streets against their leaders. That was very, very late in the day. It was not a direct signal to the Ukrainian public. It was a direct signal to the Russian public, rather. So I think there will be questions in the coming days about whether the public was prepared well enough. I know that my friends and my contacts, only those closer to government circles could sense that something was wrong from about December on, whereas most of the public believed the government when they said basically, you know, keep calm, we've been through a war in the east of Ukraine for 8 years. That war only affected people in that region, even 50 kilometres from the front line in towns like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where I spent a lot of time. After the initial phase of fighting in 2014, the war was a relatively distant prospect. Now we're seeing the conflict extend apparently across the country. So whether all that consoling and was a good idea or whether more should have been done to prepare, I think will be a question that will be one perhaps for history, perhaps not for the coming days, but it will be interesting to look back on.
Yeah, but militarily speaking, Ukraine, did they stand a chance?
Well, Ukraine has been supplied with weapons by its partners for weeks and weeks now. I mean, this has been a long and an ongoing crisis, which has given Ukraine the chance to receive some of that equipment. However, Ukraine has substantial deficits. It lost much of its fleet when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. It had been appealing, by the way, to the German government for help with that. Germany, due to its policy of not sending weapons into war zones, refused that. So there are substantial deficiencies in air power and in naval power. That gives Russia a substantial advantage. In terms of raw troops, I'm not sure. There's been a very late mobilisation of reserve forces. A lot of Ukrainians, up to 2 million, have experience fighting, and then there are the voluntary battalions and associations which played a crucial role in 2014 in fighting off a much smaller, Russian operation. So we'll see, but Russia goes into this with substantial advantages, and it's a nuclear power, let us not forget. Absolutely,
and those reservists only called up yesterday, which seems that they will certainly not be prepared to be making any kind of defence today. Charles, there's every chance that this could be an incredibly bloody and protracted war. Even perhaps people have been saying, pundits have said that it could be the bloodiest war in Europe that Europe's seen since World War II. What wider impact will this conflict have?
Again, very late in the day, Poland and Romania have started preparing for the mass arrival of refugees. People will flee firstly to the west of the country, which is thought to be safer. Cities such as Lviv, which Russia is considered unlikely to go into. So we'll see how many people stay within Ukraine, whatever's left of it after this operation. But many will flee overseas. I mean, remember that Ukrainians have visa-free travel status within the EU, which means they're entitled to come here for 3 months. So we're about to see the impact of that, the humanitarian impact of that. Remember, there are already, before this began, 1.5 million internally displaced people within Ukraine. Ukraine has also been bearing that burden largely alone. So we're going to see a much larger humanitarian crisis. The sheer scale of this is likely to dwarf the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s. We're talking about a country of 40 million, a country of over 120 million people, and they're fighting. So the US had been warning about tens of thousands of casualties. I'll just repeat, already we've heard reports from the Ukrainian Interior Ministry that in several hours there have been hundreds of casualties. So the impact is likely to be devastating, perhaps even catastrophic for Europe.
Devastating and catastrophic, yeah. Despite the long lead-in, the lead-up, we've had the build-up, it's certainly hard to comprehend this morning. All right, Charles McFedrin, thank you very much for that. Well, Vladimir Putin's announcement came as the UN Security Council was holding an emergency session in New York on the Russian threat against Ukraine. Here's what the Ukrainian ambassador had to say.
So, I was intending to ask the Russian ambassador to confirm on the record that the Russian troops will not start firing at Ukrainians today and go ahead with the offensive. It became useless 48 minutes ago. Because about 48 minutes ago, your president declared the war on Ukraine. So now I would like to ask the ambassador of the Russian Federation to say on the record that at this very moment, your troops do not shell and bomb Ukrainian cities, that your troops do not move in the territory of Ukraine. You have a smartphone, you can call Lavrov right now. We can make a pause to let you go out and call him. If you are not in a position to give an affirmative answer, the Russian Federation ought to relinquish responsibilities of the President of the Security Council, pass these responsibilities on to a legitimate member of the Security Council, a member that is respectful of the Charter, and I ask the members of the Security Council to convene an emergency meeting immediately and consider all necessary draft decisions.
Let's bring in DW's Stefan Simmons. He's standing by for us in Washington. Stefan, you heard it there, strong words by the Ukrainian representative to his Russian counterpart at that UN emergency assembly there. What do you make of those statements, and can anything at all possibly come out of this meeting?
Yeah, that was desperation on part of the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, of course, and widely understood. The Russian ambassador, who is holding the chair, the presidency of the UN Security Council, had received an earful by other countries before the United States, Ireland, Albania, and other countries in the UN Security Council had criticized Moscow and Vladimir Putin and Russia and pinpointed, finger-pointed and pointed out all of that as Russia as being the sole aggressor here in this. Just to go full circle here, the Russian ambassador to the UN did not answer any questions of the Ukrainian ambassador, and he also did not call and refused to call Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. One way or another, this was all within 30, 40 minutes, and then the first reports, as we reported here, as guests and other reporters here in DW reported, all hell broke loose then anyway, with different military strikes in different cities within the Ukraine. So this was all obsolete. Can the UN Security Council do anything? No. There is no bite, really, to the barking of the UN Security Council, and Russia knows that.
Stefan, President Biden has put out a statement. He said the world will hold Russia accountable. He's due to address the nation on Thursday. How will the US react?
Well, apparently there's a statement out now that President Zelenskyy and President Biden had a phone call. And in this phone call, President Biden assured President Zelenskyy that the U.S. is by Ukraine's side and what that means. And of course, all the allies and partners of the U.S. are with Ukraine and stand by Ukraine. Mr. Zelenskyy confirmed this also in a readout of this phone call and that this was said by the president. The president also announced that he will tomorrow announce a, quote, full scale of sanctions against Russia. So he follows basically the principle and the procedure he had announced before, that with the escalation, Russia or Vladimir Putin is employing or putting on Ukraine, and this has of course happened now, the US and the US allies and partners will react and will strike back with severe sanctions. Sanctions, not troops. No NATO troops, no US troops anywhere in Ukraine, of course, because Ukraine is not a NATO member. So it's going to be sanctions.
Yes, as we've been hearing for quite some time. Stefan Simmons, thank you very much. On Wednesday, Ukraine called up reservists and declared a state of emergency as it braced for a worst-case scenario. In eastern Ukraine, even prior to this latest development, fighting had already intensified over recent days. DW correspondent Matthias Böllinger filed this report from a village close to the line between Ukrainian and separatist-held territory.
It is quiet at the moment, a good time to leave. For days now, the people in the village of Vrubivka have been under fire. The village is in Ukrainian government-controlled territory and is being shelled by separatists from the other side.
We have been up the whole night. Some people are still in the cellar, too scared to come out. The kids spent the whole day yesterday downstairs, but at night we went upstairs. It was just too cold downstairs. A cellar is a cellar.
Half of the village has already left, the others are terrified. Shells have come down right in the center of the village. One shell hit the schoolyard while children were in class. Others have damaged people's homes. Luckily, no one has been hurt so far, but the constant stress has taken its toll. Electricity and gas have been cut off. Now gas workers have come to patch up some of the damage.
We fixed the pipe twice already. We came last week, yesterday, and today we're here again.
Vrubivka is quite far away from the artillery positions of the other side. There are 15 kilometers between here and the front line, which is just the range of this artillery that they are using. People here have not experienced this kind of fighting even during the worst times a few years ago. Olena Makarenko and her neighbors have tried to make the most out of the cold and damp cellar, but the effect of the electric heater is limited. She is in and out of the basement constantly those days.
I need to go up now to take some stuff to my daughter's place. She is finally leaving with her kids, at least to a place nearby.
She would like her to move further away until it becomes clear what the latest news from Moscow and Kyiv mean.
I don't know what to think now. I do not yet understand. I don't even know what to do next.
It takes just a few minutes and the shelling begins again.
Hello, I'm Terry Martin. You are watching a special edition of DW News on the invasion that's taking place of Ukraine by Russia. Russia has launched a military operation, what it's calling a military operation in Ukraine, in what appears to be the start of a new war in Europe. U.S. President Joe Biden has condemned what he called an unjustified and unprovoked attack. Here in Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz said it was a terrible day for Ukraine and a dark day for Europe. President Vladimir Putin announced the move in a surprise TV announcement shortly before 6 a.m. in Moscow. He warned the world that any attempt to interfere would lead to, quote, consequences you have never seen before. Ukraine says Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of the country. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Russia was attacking military infrastructure throughout the country and border guards. He urged citizens not to panic and said Ukraine would prevail. Explosions have been heard in several Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv in the east. Well, all of this, of course, is being watched with great concern in Brussels. Our Brussels Bureau Chief, Alexander van Namen, is standing by there. Alexander, how are EU and NATO leaders reacting to this?
I think that the first senior political figure here in Brussels to react to the events in Ukraine was NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who published his statement on Twitter. He strongly condemned Russia's reckless and unprovoked attack, and he continued by saying that despite NATO's efforts to give diplomacy a chance, despite NATO's repeated warnings, Russia has chosen the path of aggression. And he called on Russia to cease all military operations. And we know that this morning, the North Atlantic Council, the representatives of all 30 NATO members will be coming together to speak about consequences. And we are also seeing more and more European leaders expressing their feelings, saying that condemning Russia's action and saying that they stand in solidarity with Ukraine.
Now, when you say consequences, what form could those consequences take? Are we talking simply sanctions here again? And if so, what kind?
We are talking sanctions here again, and that is what NATO allies, what European leaders have already announced, that Russia will be targeted with massive sanctions. We are talking about political and economic sanctions. The G7 leaders are coming together this morning, and they will also decide on them. What's on the table is, for example, the proposal to cut off Russia from the electronic payment system, SWIFT, to put sectoral sanctions on Russia's energy sector, on military. There is also one option on the table to ban any exports of semiconductors, those small chips that are so important for many industries, also for Russia's military. So those are options on the table. But of course, given the situation in Ukraine, the leaders of G7, of the European Union, will decide what kind of political and economic sanctions they are determined now to impose against Russia.
Now, Alexander, we've been hearing for weeks, particularly from the United States, that an invasion of Ukraine is imminent. In Europe, there were great efforts, of course, to continue on the diplomatic path. When sanctions were introduced, just the last couple of days, they were very mild in response to what's happening in eastern Ukraine, to the recognition of those breakaway republics by President Putin in the Donbass region. Is there, within the European Union, is there a feeling that maybe those warnings that were coming, particularly from Washington, were not taken seriously enough?
depending, of course, with whom you speak, we don't have any reaction on this particular aspect you are asking about right now. But I think that the concerns were growing in the last days. The European leaders were trying to give diplomacy a chance. When you just consider how many of them visited Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, in Moscow, trying to convince him to get back to the negotiating table. But we see now that they were not successful. And I found it very interesting what was leaked from a report issued by the French presidency, quoting French President Macron as saying that the leader that he met in Moscow during his last visit was not that Russian president that he used to know earlier. So that's also interesting. But as I say, now we are hearing more and more reactions from European leaders. Some of them are also calling on the EU to give Ukraine a perspective, a closer cooperation, a clear European perspective to make clear that Europe is standing in solidarity with Kyiv.
Alexandra, thank you so much. That was our Brussels Bureau Chief, Alexandra von Namen. And we're going to cross straight to Ukraine now, where our correspondent Nick Connolly is moving through the country. I understand he is joining us on the line in eastern Ukraine, near the country's second biggest city, Kyiv. First of all, Nick, if you're with us, tell us where you are and what's happening there.
So, Jerry, I'm in a small town about 150 kilometers away from Kramatorsk, which is the administrative capital of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass, about 100 kilometers south of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city. We've got reports of explosions from both those cities, as well as from Kyiv, Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, and Odessa on the Black Sea. When I got off at this train station, basically a small town in the middle of nowhere, people told me that they had heard explosions coming from a nearby Ukrainian airfield. So their expectation was that those were Russian strikes to disable that airfield. Since I've been here, I've heard what sound like jets in the sky, military jets. We couldn't see them, but definitely not the sound of normal civilian aviation. There's kind of diffuse thuds that you sometimes hear in the background. You see police with machine guns and other kind of emergency services obviously being called up to head east towards the Donbass. Saw them stocking up on water, cigarettes and other supplies at the supermarket before they're heading off that direction. There was a big queue outside a bank here. Just heard from passers-by that the cash is now more exhausted. There's nothing more left in the cash machine because everyone basically was just queuing there to get what they could before the expectation, I guess, that things like banking would break down. There have been serious issues with internet. For now, the phone connection is still up. But most people here kind of just dazed. I think is the main thing that you see. You hear people, you see them just confused and kind of not really able to believe that after months of tensions and all this diplomatic doing and throwing, this is now actually happening.
Nick, there's also a lot of confusion as to exactly what is happening in the country and the scale of this attack. Can you give us any sense of how much of the country is being targeted? Initially, it was thought it was just the Donbass region, but now it appears that it is much wider. We're hearing reports from the Russian Defense Ministry that Ukraine's military infrastructure is being reported. We're getting reports of explosions around the country. Can you tell us the scale of this attack?
Well, it does certainly seem that this is across the country and not just restricted to Donbass. Obviously, I'm here and I'm just reliant on what I can see online as long as I have internet. I have seen images that claim to be of Ukrainian airfields, even west in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk, almost on the Polish border, that would seem to have been attacked. That was coming from Ukrainian sources. Reports, as I mentioned, from Odessa in the south and the Black Sea, reports that Russian troops had come by sea there, and similar reports of strong attacks on Mariupol, which is a city on the Sea of Azov in Donbass also. So this would seem to be all across the country at the same time, a coordinated attack. Interestingly enough, we've heard reports from Russian media and Ukrainian media saying that they looked at the metadata of Putin's speech in which he basically outlined his game plan or his operation in Ukraine, and that would seem to suggest that he had recorded that several days before, that this was premeditated, pre-planned, and that this video was then released at command in the early hours of this morning, having been recorded much earlier. It does seem to have taken the Ukrainian leadership by surprise. Reports from Ukrainian media saying they weren't able to get through to Ukrainian government speakers, that they hadn't really weren't on that Putin speech as fast as maybe they should be, and it did take a while for President Zelenskyy to react. A sense here, though, now that things are changing, that the police and that other emergency services are heading towards the front lines. No overwhelming sense of panic from them, but certainly concern and confusion, given that most people here for the longest time thought those warnings from Washington and from London were exaggerated, that this was just brinkmanship from Vladimir Putin, and didn't really want to believe that these threats and that build-up of Russian troops along the border was actually real and going to be used against Ukraine.
Nick, thank you very much for now. We'll be coming back to you, of course, throughout the day. That was our correspondent, Nick Connolly, who was joining us just outside Ukraine's second biggest city, Kyiv, in the east. Well, Russia, just bringing you up to date, Russia has launched what it calls a military operation in Ukraine. It appears to be the start of a new war in Europe. U.S. President Joe Biden has condemned what he called an unjustified and unprovoked attack. Here in Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz said it was a terrible day for Ukraine and a dark day for Europe. President Vladimir Putin announced the move in a surprise TV announcement shortly before 6 a.m. in Moscow. He warned the world that any attempt to interfere would lead to, quote, consequences you have never seen. Ukraine says that Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of the country. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that Russia was attacking military infrastructure throughout the country and that it was also attacking border guards. He urged citizens not to panic and said that Ukraine would prevail. Explosions have been heard in several Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv, where we just heard from in the east. Well, DW's Charles McFedrin joins me now here in the studio for more. Charles, I know that you have close contacts with Ukraine. You travel there often. You know many people in the country. You've been following this extremely closely. Talk us through what we know.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the past few minutes, Ukraine's border guards and another of the Ukrainian ministries have confirmed that Russia and Belarus together have crossed the border from the north towards the capital, Kyiv. So we now have Ukraine being apparently invaded from three directions.
Now, when you say cross the border, Charles, are you saying that there are troops, there are vehicles, and perhaps tanks, heavy artillery?
All we have are initial reports that there is an operation underway by Russia and Belarus on the northern Ukrainian border. So that is very, very substantial news, because my Western intelligence sources in one European country, they didn't think that Russia had enough troops to actually cross that border. But it seems that they've received assistance from Belarus in that sense, if you believe the Ukrainian authorities when they make that claim. So that's a very substantial development.
And we should note that Russia and Belarus have been carrying out joint military exercises in that region and have been amassing troops on the border, which the U.S. had said had moved into strike position within the last few days. And just give us a sense of how close the capital, Kyiv, is to that border to Belarus, where those troops are.
Right. We're talking about 200 kilometres. It's a relatively difficult area to get through. You're talking about the site where Chernobyl happened, so that's a very large wetland around that area. There are limited bridges, there are limited road crossings. It'll be interesting to see if there'll be an advance on that front. However, that is certainly very surprising. It had been believed that perhaps there would be airstrikes and missile strikes on Kyiv. That had been what I've been hearing from security sources. However, the actual fact or the actual claim that troops have now crossed over that border, that is very surprising indeed. What we know, Terry, in addition to that, is that there is very, very heavy fighting going on in the east of the country that had already begun, but at around 3 or 4 a.m. local time overnight, we saw the offensive begin. I've heard also from contacts in Kramatorsk, as Nick was mentioning, that was the capital of the Ukrainian administrative part of Donbass, and he said people are and the people I spoke to rather are in absolute panic as the fighting intensifies. So very disturbing reports. The internet is still on in Kyiv, and people have been hearing constant explosions. I'm not able to establish contact with people I know close to Borispol airport. It is thought that Russia is targeting infrastructure such as Borispol. We'll see how targeted those operations actually will be, given Russian military is not necessarily known for that if you look at the history of their operations in Syria and in Chechnya. So very disturbing reports. The Ukrainian Interior Ministry quoted already hundreds of casualties. We're talking about a country with 40 million people, and it's now under attack from what seems like 3 fronts. So very disturbing day for Europe, I would say, Terry.
What about the Ukrainian forces? Are they fighting back?
I mean, some military reporters say they are fighting back. I mean, obviously, a lot of Ukraine's military had been concentrated in the Donbass region. The American Senator Marco Rubio tweeted earlier this morning that he expected Russia to try to cut through the country, which means isolate the capital, Kyiv, because a lot of those forces are concentrated in the Donbass region, but they'd had months to prepare. There'll be questions asked about if they took the threat seriously enough, but certainly there'd been a mobilisation that started slowly at the beginning of the year as more and more indications came in, and then accelerated, but very, very late. 900,000 reservists only called up 24 hours before all this began, or less than that. Of course, the strategy of the Ukrainian government had been on diplomacy. It had been on its allies. It didn't want to provoke Russia into something like this, but it's happened anyway, Terry.
Now, you, of course, listened to President Putin making his announcement about this military operation. He suggested that he was going to take out the government in Kyiv. What do you make of that?
I would say President Putin never accepted the legitimacy of the democratically elected governments after Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Ukraine plunged into political turmoil over a EU association agreement in 2014. The President, Viktor Yanukovych, after months of protests, which ended in a very, very bloody fashion, allegedly when riot police fired on the protesters, he was impeached by Parliament. He was a close ally of President Putin. After that, President Putin took to referring to the Ukrainian government, which was re-elected 2 months later in an election observed by the OSCE. He started referring to them as a Nazi junta. Those rather disturbing and false claims have resurfaced in recent days, Terry, and he used them as a justification for indeed attacking a country with a Jewish president. He called it a Nazi junta in his speech overnight. By the way, Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta is reporting that the speech that President Putin delivered to the nation was actually recorded on Monday, according to their verification. The Nobel Peace Prize winning newspaper Novaya Gazeta. So I think there'll be questions asked how long President Putin has been planning this. Is this something that he's been waiting to do for days, months, or even years?
Charles, thank you for now. That was our DW correspondent, Charles McFedrin. Thanks for being with us, Charles. Now, let's get the latest from Brussels. Our correspondent, Alexandra Frontline, joins us from there. Alexandra, Europe is just waking up to this. It's just shortly before 7 a.m. here in Germany and also in Brussels. We're getting some responses coming already from the German leader. What else are you hearing from Brussels, from EU and NATO leaders?
Well, of course, all of them are condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. And it's quite interesting that the senior European representatives, European leaders, such as the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Council, all of them have published the same statement condemning Russia's actions, as I said, speaking of dark hours in Europe, saying that their thoughts are with the innocent people, women, children, men in Ukraine, a quite a strong statement, and of course condemning this unprovoked attack, and also promising that they will hold the Kremlin accountable.
Now, Alexandra, there have been multiple diplomatic efforts, of course, leading up to this, and obviously they did not bear fruit. Is there what can the West do at this point to turn this around, or is all hope lost?
Well, we can assume that that is what the leaders will be talking about. They will meet together virtually in the G7 format. Then we expect European leaders, leaders of the members of the European Union to come here in person together this afternoon in Brussels. That is at least a meeting that was scheduled yesterday, surprisingly. And the question is whether there is anything they could now do to deter Russia from escalating further, for moving further on Ukraine, or whether we are now talking about measures that will be regarded as punishment. And of course, what is on the agenda or on the table, if you will, are massive sanctions that were announced by Europe, by the European Union, by the UK, by the US. On Tuesday, they already imposed some sanctions in a limited scope, but at the same time, they made it clear that more is coming, and that is probably what we are going to see today. Sanctions against whole sectors of Russia's industry, a ban on semiconductors exports to Russia, sanctions against Vladimir Putin, presumably against Russian elites, oligarchs. That is, I think, what is now on the agenda. And at the same time, there are more and more European leaders that are saying we need to give Ukraine a clear European perspective.
Alexandra, there had been warnings that an invasion was imminent. Europe, of course, was hoping that diplomacy would bear fruit. Obviously, it hasn't. Did this catch some European leaders by surprise, do you think?
I don't think that they are now caught by surprise because, as I said, we heard yesterday they were coming together. It was clear that now they fear that a potential full-scale invasion could be imminent. But of course, you are right pointing out that there were differences in the assessments of the Biden administration and of different European governments. And we saw many of the European leaders trying to convince Vladimir Putin to get back to the negotiating table and to give diplomacy a chance. And of course, we now see that they were not successful. But at the same time, we can assume that, of course, they will try again to convince Vladimir Putin to stop this military operation. And I could imagine that in addition to sanctions, in addition to more pressure and maybe even to other measures, more support for Ukraine, we will also see some leaders saying that now we still need to talk to the Russian government.
Alexandra, thank you very much. That was our Brussels Bureau Chief, Alexandra von Namen. Well, as we come up on 7 a.m. Central European time here in the German capital, I just want to give you an update of what's been happening in Ukraine. Russia has launched what it calls a military operation in Ukraine in what appears to be the start of a new war in Europe. U.S. President Joe Biden has condemned what he called an unjustified and unprovoked attack. Here in Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz said it was a terrible day for Ukraine and a dark day for Europe. President Vladimir Putin announced the move in a surprise television announcement shortly before 6 a.m. in Moscow time. He warned the world that any attempt to interfere would lead to, quote, consequences you have never seen. Ukraine says Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of the country. Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelenskyy said Russia was attacking military infrastructure throughout the country and border guards. We also heard a statement from the defense ministry earlier confirming that they were targeting military infrastructure in Ukraine, saying that they're using very targeted, precise missiles for that. Well, Vladimir Zelenskyy urged citizens in Ukraine not to panic and said Ukraine would prevail. Explosions have been heard in several Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv in the east. DW's Thomas Sparrow, our political correspondent, joins me now here in the studio. Thomas, thanks for coming in. Tell us what has been happening here, first of all, in Germany in response to the events that are unfolding in Ukraine.
Well, we already heard what Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said in response to this latest situation. But in general, what the German government has been doing in the last few days, in the last few weeks, as they prepare for this, has been a two-way strategy. On the one hand, making sure that in any way as possible, channels of communication are open to talk to Vladimir Putin. So that's the reason why, for example, only a few days ago or a few weeks ago, Olaf Scholz was in Moscow talking to Vladimir Putin. We obviously now see that those efforts, not only from a German perspective, but internationally, have not been successful. The second part of the strategy was coordinating with its allies, with German allies, on what sanctions they could impose. That's something that, as Alexandra mentioned from Brussels, already happened a few days ago. So that first tranche of sanctions which have already been put out. And what leaders, including Olaf Scholz, made clear is that they were leaving some room with those sanctions in case Russia went further, which is what we're seeing right now. So I do expect that what we'll see is even further sanctions coming from Germany and coming from other countries, in particular trying to show that EU unity when it comes to imposing those sanctions that would certainly affect Russia's key infrastructure, that would also target specific persons. Now, it's important to stress that sanctions have been the preferred measure by the US, the preferred measure by the European Union, not only now, but in the past when it comes to dealing with these kinds of situations. There are different views as to whether sanctions work or don't work. Those who are against the idea of sanctions stress precisely that they don't stop leaders like Vladimir Putin from carrying out these attacks or from carrying out his plans, so that other actions might be needed to deter precisely leaders like Vladimir Putin. Those who do believe that sanctions are the best way forward say they affect key areas of a country's economy or infrastructure, and as such, they do help to prevent the situation from getting worse. So you have different views on what is already a very important way of reacting to these kinds of situations and events.
You talked about different views. There have also been different views within the German political establishment regarding how to deal with Russia. Germany has faced criticism that it has not been supportive enough to Ukraine and its allies in leading up to this point, that Germany refused to provide weapons, for example, to Ukraine. It also seemed to have blocked delivery of weapons from other European Union member states, particularly Estonia. Is Germany now unified in its political sense in dealing with Russia and speaking with one voice?
There have always been different views from the German political establishment on how to deal with Russia. You see that clearly in the different party constellations here. You see that currently now in the three-way coalition that's ruling Germany. There have been different views there altogether when it comes, for example, to the very controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the German government decided now to freeze. I can mention something about that key pipeline in a second, but it's really important to understand that these views that you see internally here in Germany then also play, obviously, a very important role when it comes to deciding what kind of foreign policy Germany will pursue in this. And Germany has for a long time maintained, something that, by the way, also happened with former Chancellor Angela Merkel, that it was important to keep those bridges between Germany and Russia, that it was important to keep those economic relations between Germany and Russia, precisely to make sure that when a situation arises that the West considers aggressive or that the West considers not in line with their values, that there could be some sort of dialogue. At the same time, however, it was very clear that Germany was distancing itself politically from Russia, as were other countries in the European Union. So you saw that two-way dynamic within Germany, but also in what Germany projected outside. Now, with Nord Stream 2 pipeline, this is an absolutely, I would say, the biggest and the most controversial infrastructure project in the world right now. For a long time, German leaders, including Olaf Scholz only a few weeks ago, had stressed that that was mostly a private sector enterprise, that it was something that did not have major political impact. And they defended the project, obviously, also by saying that it was important to increase the amount of gas that reached Germany. However, critics, not only here in Germany, like, for example, the Green Party, but also some of Germany's most important political allies, like the United States or countries like Poland, had been extremely critical of the Nord Stream pipeline because they believed two things. One, that it would leave Europe too vulnerable in case Russia did something that went too far. We're seeing that in a way right now. And second, that it gave Moscow too much power. And that's why for a long time they had really asked for this project to be halted. And that's why the sign that we saw from Germany only a few days ago to halt that project was welcomed by Germany's political allies.
So Germany's decision to finally suspend the certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project was seen as quite a big step for the country. That is an around 11 billion euro project right there. Thomas, looking forward now, we're now at the point that everyone had feared and had hoped would not happen. We have what appears to be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin is talking openly about replacing the government in Kyiv. What role Europe is now going to have to respond to this? The European Union is going to have to respond to this. What role do you see Germany taking in Europe, the European Union's response to this Russian aggression against Ukraine moving forward?
One important element that Germany might be discussing even more now is that decision not to send defensive weapons to Ukraine. It's a decision that the German government has defended on various occasions and on different grounds, historical grounds, but also because they believe that sending weapons to crisis zones would not necessarily help to find a diplomatic solution. And that's, by the way, something that the German government has stated on various occasions by saying that the German public also supports that. We saw a poll only yesterday which again revealed that a majority of Germans do not feel that the right way forward is for Germany to send defensive weapons to Ukraine.
And Chancellor Scholz was always eager to mention that too.
He was always eager to mention that too, so it will be interesting to see how that debate shifts here in Germany. By the way, you may have seen that yesterday the Brandenburg Gate was lit up in the Ukrainian colours. And the reaction that came from the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany was actually very interesting because he called it sort of delayed sign of support by Germany, but he said what Germany should really be doing to help Ukraine is not necessarily lighting up the Brandenburg Gate, but precisely sending defensive weapons, increasing its economic aid, and increasing sanctions on Russia. And specifically this second point, increasing economic aid, I do think that's the role Germany is going to start to play in all this. I am not sure whether Germany would send defensive weapons to Ukraine. I am sure that Germany would say, as Olaf Scholz has stressed in the past, that the way in which Germany plays a role in this is with money. It's economically. It's helping Ukraine, and they will probably increase that.
Well, yeah, that, of course, is built on the assumption that the government holds in Kyiv and that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is not replaced, which appears to be Vladimir Putin's game plan. Thank you very much, Thomas, and we'll be coming back to you in just a moment, I'm sure. But first, let's go to Vladimir Esipov. He's from DW's Russian service. He joins us now here in Berlin. Talk to us, Vladimir, about Vladimir Putin's address. In his televised speech in the early hours this morning, he made quite a dramatic announcement. How did he justify the military offensive against Ukraine?
Well, President Putin was very clear about the Russian goals in the Ukraine. First of all, there was two main goals declared. First of all, a demilitarization of the country, which means Russia is going to destroy the military infrastructure of the Ukraine, what we are witnessing in the recent hours already. And the second Russian goal declared by President Putin is denazification of the Ukraine. And translating from the language used in the universe of the Russian government, it means that most probably the Ukrainian government, the current Ukrainian government, should be brought down by the Russian force somehow, because in the universe of the Russian government, Ukrainian government, puppet government ruled by the United States, ruled from Washington D.C., and they are all like Nazis and fascists. And this kind of rhetoric we are hearing since 8 years, since 2014 Maidan revolution on the streets of Kyiv. So what we see right now, it's Russia is trying to achieve these goals since a couple of hours.
Okay, let's listen in to what Vladimir Putin said in that statement a while ago.
Whoever tries to interfere with us, and even more so to create threats for our country, people should know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to such consequences that you have never experienced in your history.
That was very much a warning to the West in terms of how it's going to gauge its response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. When Vladimir Putin says there could be consequences like the world has never seen before, this is a nuclear-armed country speaking there. What do you think he means?
He means that whoever would try to help Ukraine with the military means, either with weapon deliveries or even with the troops on the ground, will face a very stark response from the Russia. At the same time, what we see right now in the Russian cities, a kind of a Russian ruble and the Russian currency in the free fall. So it's I would not describe it as a panic, but if you look at the currency exchange, the Russian ruble is in record lows right at the moment. Russian stock exchange in Moscow and in St. Petersburg are stopped, so there is no stock exchange for today. And the Russian airports are being closed all across the regions bordering to the Ukraine. So it's already some costs on the Russian public as well.
Okay, but getting back to what? Yeah, okay, but I mean, sorry, I'm just trying to understand what sort of leverage Putin would have against those, presumably the United States, the European Union, who might be trying to help Ukraine in this situation. He's warning that if assistance is given to Ukraine, that there will be a punitive response from Moscow. Do you have any idea what form that punitive response he's referring to, that these warnings he's given, what they might be?
I would expect that Russia will try to take over Ukrainian military infrastructure, especially airspaces and airports, as soon as possible. So it will be just not possible to deliver any military help in the next hours and in the next days. Once again, it's a very stark warning by the leader of the nuclear powers. So I think it's all-out war of Russia against the West. Basically.
So we really don't know what form of reaction we might get from Vladimir Putin. Of course, we are getting reports of massive cyber attacks already underway, targeted specifically against Ukraine, but we're also seeing reports of systems in the Baltic states, for example, being taken down. We know that other countries have vulnerable infrastructure, particularly the Baltic states, that draw much of their electricity directly from Russia. So I'm just trying to figure that out, but I guess we'll see how that evolves in the coming days. Looking ahead, what do you think that Vladimir Putin, listening to what his speech is and listening to all of his statements over the last few months, also looking at the papers that he's been writing where he has described Ukraine as not being a state, really, that it is really simply part of Russia. What do you think his ultimate game plan is with Ukraine?
I'm afraid that once again the military infrastructure is being destroyed right now in very quick terms. So with the missiles attacks and with the troops on the ground, obviously. And in the second step, the government will be removed somehow, or Russia will try to remove the Ukrainian government, at least from Kyiv. So it's a very dangerous development for the country. So what happens after Russia achieved its goals, no one really knows. Putin mentioned that Russia will not occupy the Ukraine, but if you destroy the military infrastructure and bring down the government, and the next logical steps is to occupy the country, to control the population and to control what's happening on the ground.
Vladimir, thank you very much for now. That's Vladimir Esipov from DW's Russian service. Well, just another quick update. Russia has launched what it calls a military operation in Ukraine in what appears to be the start of a new war in Europe. U.S. President Joe Biden has condemned what he called an unjustified and unprovoked attack. Here in Germany, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, said it was a terrible day for Ukraine and a dark day for Europe. President Vladimir Putin, as we mentioned, has announced the move in a surprise television address that came shortly before 6 a.m. Moscow time. He warned the world that any attempt to interfere would lead to, quote, consequences you've never seen before. Ukraine says Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of the country, not just targeting the Donbass region. Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelenskyy said Russia was attacking military infrastructure throughout Ukraine and border guards as well. He urged citizens not to panic, though, and said Ukraine would prevail. Explosions have been heard in several Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv in the east. Let's go now to our Russian affairs analyst, Konstantin Egert. He's on the line from Vilnius. That's the capital of Lithuania, of course. Konstantin, what happened?
Well, firstly, maybe, Terry, just a bit of personal reaction. I'm absolutely stunned, and what I see on TV screens reminds me of my mother's stories. She spent the whole of the Second World War in Moscow. Her house was bombed into ruins. And I never thought I'll see something from the old newsreels in front of my own eyes. So it was a very sad day for me personally. I think it is a very, very important pivotal moment in the history of Russia. The Russian government actually decided to bring down an Iron Curtain between Russia and at least the Western world. That is what is happening, in fact. I'm also, and here I would concur with my colleague Vladimir Esipov, who spoke to you moments ago, that the most important, or one of the most important elements in Vladimir Putin's speech is this mention of denazification. That means that it will not be just, a military operation. It's an attempt to establish full control of Ukraine, put in some kind of pro-Moscow government in Kyiv, and actually cleanse repress those who object. So what we see something that, can't be achieved in a matter of a few hours and definitely not even a few weeks. And this is what creates a lot of ambiguity. And this is something that probably, and I'm afraid, the West never expected and never thought it would be challenged with. So this is a very dangerous moment. Definitely for Europe, if not for the world.
What about Russians themselves, Konstantin? You have, as you mentioned, very close contacts to Russia. You have deep roots there yourself. Do the Russian people support this move by Vladimir Putin?
Well, if you believe the pro-government polling organizations that are financed by the government, in fact, then it's Putin's decision to recognize the so-called republics got nearly 80% support. Whether you can believe it or not, I don't know. I think independent pollsters show that the support is much lower, and you have to probably about 45%, 50%. And you have to add to that routinely the Russian public doesn't tell the truth, doesn't tell what it thinks to pollsters because people are afraid to voice their views. Not all of them, but part of them definitely. It's not because they are in active opposition to Mr. Putin, but because it's a traditional Russian caution. You have to remember Russia lived through a horrific dictatorship in the 20th century. So caution is number one. Number two, I do not think that there's going to be a support for it on the level of the support for the Crimea, because people are now getting all these images in Russia too. And I think that most nations, I don't want to sound cynical, but most nations like their wars small, victorious, and preferably bloodless. Images of that are going to pour through social media into Russia, in spite of Putin's propaganda machine, in spite of Putin's TV and everything. They're going to alert the people that, this is not something that we subscribe to. Whether there are going to be active protests, I don't think that initially there's going to be a mass protest movement. But what I think may happen over time is weariness with the situation, weariness with impending isolation of Russia, economic difficulties. Over time, that will take effect. But I do not think we can expect, thousands of people in the Red Square demanding that Putin resigns and the war stopped. I think Russians have been pretty much down all this time, very much concerned about their day-to-day lives. I don't think that we'll see them coming out of this mood very soon.
You are in one of the Baltic republics. You're in Lithuania. You move a lot between Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Those former Soviet republics are very much on edge, given what has happened. How concerned are they that this could have an impact on them?
Well, first of all, the Baltic states never accepted that they were members of the Soviet Union. Here people say they were occupied. And in fact, that was not recognized by most of the West at the time, just a small historical aside. But yes, I think that the mood here is very subdued, but also it is that of stark realism. The Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Poles were telling Berlin, Paris, London, Washington that Putin will not stop after 2014. Now they were proved right. And I think that there's also a mood of concentration because the feeling here is that all bets are off and that in case Moscow's operation in Ukraine is successful, then probably Poland and the Baltic states could be next on the list in spite of NATO membership. Because the understanding here is that Putin sees the West as weak and he will, if he wins in Ukraine, he will continue to probe the West, and the eastern flank is basically his first port of call. You remember Putin's speech a few days ago when he said that basically all borders are, to put it mildly, negotiable. All borders established after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think that there is heightened tension here. There are going to be cyber attacks. We're already getting some news of that. And there's a big hope here that NATO will not leave its members, its Baltic members alone. And President Biden, as we know, said that reinforcements will be sent to the Baltic states, American reinforcements. So there is this hope for basically NATO putting a wall between the Baltic states and Putin's Russia.
Konstantin, thank you very much for now. That was our Russian affairs correspondent there, Konstantin Ega, joining us from Lithuania, telling us that the Baltic states, too, are quite concerned.